As you all remember, 4 years ago, September 11th through the 13th, this stationary precipitation event kind of was unique in Colorado, not only in the amount of rain that it dropped over a 72-hour period, in some areas upwards of 17 inches of rain, which, as many of you know, our annual precipitation averages in Colorado are more like 14 and a half inches. And so this was extreme, but also it just parked itself right over the foothills, right? So kind of right along the peak to peak highway, and it just sat there. And that, as we all know, is unusual in Colorado. And so as a result, there was an accumulation of rain in a way that we have not seen in the Front Range, at least since the big Thompson flood and so forth in the 70s. So in the aftermath of this event, we saw the kind of classic mountain canyon flash flooding event for many communities, but then we also saw a very different event for some of our plains and agricultural communities as that pulse of water slowly moved out towards Greeley and Evans and Milliken and other communities. And so it was an interesting event in that it had very different characteristics depending on where you were situated on the Front Range. So with the kind of overall question that motivates our whole research project is, do communities learn or change in response to extreme events? And here we're really wondering about whether or not communities learn specific lessons that they then translate into how they changes in public policy or organizations or the management of their municipal governments in order to be better prepared for disasters in the future. So one of the things that struck us early on when we started to dig into a lot of the academic literature is that there is this gap that not a lot of people have researched, which is in trying to understand the processes that can be put in place, the arrangements in government organizations that lead to, we're more likely to see policies emerge from that help reduce community vulnerability to disaster events. And so our focus here is on how policies are formed and decided on, and what actors are influential in this process within local governments. So, that's kind of our motivating question behind this. And we draw on a whole lot. I put this up here not so that you read it all, but so that you can understand our questions about learning. This word seems to be pretty straightforward, and I'm looking at Professor Tanya Heikkila here and kind of chuckling because she does a lot of work in this area. And when we think about learning, we all kind of assume, well, learning, I mean, this is what K-12 education does every day, right? We measure learning and we test our kids ad nauseum to figure out if they're learning and what they're learning and how much they're progressing. But when we talk about learning collectively within organizations and whether those organizations themselves learn lessons, that gets a lot trickier. And so when we're asking this question of does learning occur and what do we see as a result of learning, really what we are trying to do is figure out what type of learning. Are we learning kind of very basic lessons of how to navigate FEMA's reimbursement processes? Probably, right? Those are important lessons, especially for communities as they recover and rebuild. But are communities also learning perhaps different governmental structures or processes or organizations within their municipal governments perhaps that could be more effective in responding to and recovering from disasters long term, right? So that's kind of a higher level type of learning that might be learned. And then we also may see learning along the lines of understanding the degree to which a community is vulnerable to events like extreme flooding or wildfires and other types of events. So we might see learning that we would call social learning, where we're learning about causal factors, we're learning about vulnerability, and maybe we're doing something really big and proactive to try to make our community holistically less vulnerable to these risks. And so that's what we were focused on in this research. And so overall, we're looking essentially at, if we have an extreme event like the floods, There are a number of things that we have analyzed over the last 4 years, from the extent and type of damage in communities, the perception of risk held by residents and also by folks who work in municipal government, the processes, participatory processes that communities put in place during recovery, the resources, both financial, staff, human resources, technical resources, relationships with other governments and entities, and then eventually, this is something we'll talk about with folks this afternoon, we haven't started analyzing yet, but also media coverage and kind of the broader public conversation about these things. And whether or not, as a result of any of those or a combination of those, we see what we call policy learning as a result. So here today, we're going to really look at the guiding questions of, does the extent and type of damage matter to policy learning? Does the type of public participation matter? Do resources, either individual resources that residents have or the community level? And do perceptions of future risk matter to learning lessons about extreme events? And it's important, many of us have seen this kind of simplistic notion of the disaster cycle, in that we have disaster preparedness, where we're gearing up to mostly respond with emergency management functions and so forth. Our research is right here after that emergency response is concluded. As many of you know who work in municipal government, there is a point in time where you formally move into disaster response. And that's the space and time that we're looking at. And we started our research in particular to look at that disaster recovery. So now I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth Cobley, who's going to talk about the research methods we learned.
Hey guys. Awesome. It's so nice to see so many of you. I was very fortunate to be on the research team and to travel to every community, do a lot of cool explorations of all of the recovery projects that were going on, see sites of damage, kind of get a sense of things firsthand. I felt really fortunate to learn from all of you as I was doing this. So I'll tell you a little bit about kind of a broader study design and how we collected some data on the communities that we used in this study. So we looked at 7 communities in the 3 hardest hit counties by FEMA estimates. So you can see up here. So Essex Park, Loveland, and Larimer County, Lyons, Boulder, Bunline, Boulder County, really Evans, and Weld County. And we looked at these different communities and hope to vary them on things like the economic sectors that drive the communities, the size of the communities, the impact of the flood on the communities, those sorts of things to give us a bigger picture. We know they're not representative of every community that experienced flood damage, but we decided that this would help us kind of understand the breadth of different response measures, recovery actions, things like that. We collected data in a number of ways, and I'll just kind of briefly go over those. So we started back in October 2013 through February 2014. Our communities were transitioning from response to recovery, and Desiree and Betsy were the ones that conducted 24 at this time. And then as we moved into 2016, we repeated that. So a little bit further down here, we did another round of 23 interviews with local government recovery staff. And a lot of these people were the same people from year to year, but there were retirements. Many of your communities got funds to hire people that were specific to flood recovery, those sorts of things. So some of those populations changed a little bit. Also in 2016, we interviewed local government flood recovery finance personnel. We'll kind of dig into a couple of finance lessons specifically. So I spoke with one person from every community that worked on finance, as well as 7 of the watershed coalitions at that time. In 2017, we repeated our local government interview one more time, and this should actually be 23, not 10. So we had one final round, and this was just recently, so I talked to many of you guys in the spring of this year. And we also did 10 interviews with Colorado State government staff. And some of these different groups, finance personnel, watershed personnel, state staff, these were things that we started talking to our communities about, and they said, these are people you need to talk to really understand the full picture. You need to be able to learn how our community connect with the state to get resources, how we can work with NGOs and other groups, how we deal with finance, that really became kind of a new topic as that emerged throughout our study. So we kind of adjusted our research function methods to hopefully respond a little bit to the needs of the community. We also conducted a couple different surveys. So in 2014, 2015, and 2016, we surveyed what we called experts, local government staff, board members, elected officials, people who are really kind of deeply involved in these processes, about what kind of projects their communities were doing, etc. And then we ended up with 248 survey responses there. And then we also residents of communities, and they were selected for some that experienced flooding and some that didn't experience flooding. We had responses there. And so we'll use this data to kind of talk through some of our findings. We also collected documents, 1,825 documents. And how we did this, it was quite a process, is we collected all of the documents. I probably called many of you asking this to have this your community's document repository at some point. We collected all flood-related documents in all of our 7 communities over the entire period from when the floods took place to 3 years later. And we ended up coding these documents or reviewing them for specific issues. And these were public outreach and media documents, city council minutes and memos, minutes from every board and commission or flood recovery task force in every community, and every planning session document. So this allowed us to kind of track how different communities approach different policy changes and just see that kind of broader and maybe even more formal reflection of what was going on in the community. All right, so I'm not gonna talk too much about this, but this is just a kind of timeline if you would prefer kind of a visual image of this. So these are our local government staff interviews at 3 points in time. Some expert surveys at 3 points in time, resident surveys that we just finished up our 2nd one recently, and then financial, and this is also watershed interviews and state interviews. So I'm not going to present too much information on our communities right now, but I did just want to kind of explain that we use these documents in tandem first to kind of better understand the basic summary information about our communities, both related to their damage and their fiscal capacity. And this also helped us make sure we were looking at communities that really did experience a wide variety of breadth and different types of extensive damage, and then had different capacities to deal with that damage over time. And we'll dig into each of these a little bit more later in our presentation. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Betsy to start presenting some of our data.
Thank you, Elizabeth. For those of you that have just entered, I'm Elizabeth Albright from Duke University. I also go by Betsy if you want to differentiate the two Elizabeths on the team. So thank you all for coming. My main role in the project was the initial round of interviews post-flood in December is when I first flew out. And I've also been intimately involved in both the experts, or the local official task force survey, as well as the public survey. I like to think of myself as holding down the math side of the project. So first we're going to dip into risk perceptions and talk a little bit about what the literature tells us, why risk perceptions or how we perceive future risks may matter in terms of moving policies forward. And then we'll look at some data and what we gleaned from both the public and the expert survey. So first, the literature talks broadly about how experts, and when I say experts, I'm broadly talking about local officials, people who are more intimately involved, as Desiree described, and then the public tend to see risks of extreme events very differently, right? People that are more intimately involved, scientists, technical experts, view risk more mathematically, more of probability of future event occurring times the perceived damage of that said event. Whereas the public more thinks of future risks more holistically, more broadly, and don't necessarily tease out these two components, right? The probabilities and the perceived damage. another piece of the literature is what's the role of experiencing a damaging event to how people think about future events. And this really might matter if you get hit by a flood, by an earthquake, etc. Do you think the risk going forward is increasing, or do you think I just experienced it, therefore it won't happen again? All right, two different trains of thought, and the literature here is actually somewhat mixed on this. It depends on how the question was asked, in what disaster context did it occur. So based on the 2 rounds of expert surveys and the 2 rounds of public surveys, again, as Elizabeth mentioned, the public survey was around 200 of you all, and thank you for answering the surveys first off. And 3 rounds of those, and 2 rounds of the public, 1 by mail, primarily by mail, and 1 primarily online over a 2-year period. And we got about 900 responses there. So the thing that struck me looking at the data is that, particularly in terms of flood severity and probability of future flood risks, we're seeing some differences between how the public and how local officials or the experts perceive those risks. With the experts, generally speaking, or broadly speaking, see higher risks going forward and flooding as a more severe problem than the general public. And we, in the sampling, we stratified the sample in each community based on flooded and not flooded, and controlled in our models for the extent that they were flood damaged as well. Here we have a bar graph of the differences in risk perceptions, with the blue being the experts or the stakeholders or you all, and the green being public. And by and large, you can see here, except for in Estes Park, and I'd love to talk to folks in Estes Park about this finding, is we're seeing that local officials perceive a higher risk going forward for flooding. The question asks a couple of different things. One, what's the probability of an extreme flood occurring in the next 10 years? One, what's the probability of an extreme flood occurring in the next 50 years? And by and large, the stakeholders, again, perceive greater risks, greater problem severity than the public. I believe I've touched on that first point. Another set of factors that matters is gender. Females, by and large, feel greater risk, and this aligns with the risk perception literature, than males. And surprisingly, controlling for a number of different factors, we found, and this is in the public survey, excuse me, that those that experienced more damage to their personal property actually perceive a lower risk of future floods, holding other factors constant. Right, so in getting to that question of what's the impact of floods and how do people see flood risks going forward, that's an interesting finding. It's less clear what the role of community and neighborhood perceptions of damage, and those seem to be more positive predictors. If you perceive your neighborhood as being severely damaged, not your own personal property, but your neighborhood, then you're going to have a higher, on average, perception of risk going forward. And then we ask questions of community recovery and damage as well. So thank you all very much. I look forward to going more in depth this afternoon.
One of the other questions we asked was whether or not the participatory processes or the kind of engagement and stakeholder outreach processes that municipal governments establish during disaster recovery, whether that matters to kind of the long-term outcomes, whether that's one of the factors that kind of predicts greater policy change towards reducing vulnerability to risk in the future. So from the literature tells us two main things very clearly. One is that public participation can do extraordinary things in terms of increasing buy-in for government decisions. So by involving a number of different stakeholders, including residents and others, in the decision process, governments are able to kind of increase their buy-in. And also it helps increase the trust and the networks or relationships that exist within a community. So a whole host of other literature shows that those relationships and networks then very clearly predict more successful disaster recovery across a community, right? So this is what later we'll use the term resilience. But when we talk about resilience, it's a very complex thing that involves both environmental aspects and the built environment. It also includes the economic sectors and business and tax base and so forth. And also what we call community resilience, which is kind of trust, which is the presence of non-governmental organizations, faith-based groups and relationships and how vulnerable individuals are in communities. So a community that has a lot of inequities or has pockets of extreme poverty may be more vulnerable to risk, because even if most of the community is doing okay, there are pockets that will be very severely impacted. And so that resilience is important. And we know from the literature that these trusts and what networks within a community are very important to disaster recovery. So at the same time, we also know that kind of more sustained and deliberative stakeholder engagement processes are very uncommon with government organizations because they're difficult. Sometimes it's just tough. It's like herding cats to get a whole bunch of different people with different perspectives at the table, but also to sustain that over time, to ask that time commitment, not only of your staff, but also of the public, of different constituency groups. It can also be expensive, both in kind of actual tangible resources as well as staff time that could be devoted elsewhere. And so it is this kind of more sustained, deliberative type of participation is generally thought to be avoided, but in the literature, when we talk about public participation, we see that it's not used very commonly. One of the really interesting findings, because here this would suggest that a government's resources, its capacity, would predict the likelihood of it doing really kind of sustained, engaged stakeholder processes. So that would suggest that larger, more well-resourced governments would be more likely to do this. And we do see some of that, right? So Boulder does kind of, after in the wake of the floods, Boulder did kind of some neighborhood meetings, mostly focused on really trying to learn from residents what the flood event looked like, right? So the flood didn't come down Boulder Canyon like they've been talking about for so long. And so really, what did it look like in neighborhoods and in some of the kind of ditches and streams where it did hit hard? So we do see that prediction of kind of higher government capacity can be supported. But one of the very interesting things that we saw is that actually, driven by limited resources, our two smallest communities had some of the more sustained stakeholder processes. So I'll start with Evans. And with the interviews, one thing we do with interviews when we interviewed many of you and your colleagues is we transcribe these interviews so that they become a lot of text. And then we analyze that to understand really what you're saying and whether things change in those 3 points in time where we interviewed you. And so in Evans, one of the things that they did, in some ways this looks kind of like a traditional stakeholder process in that it was focused by and large on kind of communicating information needed by the public to the public, right? They also developed a flood recovery on that task force and kind of consult with the local government and recovery decisions. So that was interesting, but even more intriguing than that, and I think many of you know this, is Lyons, as everyone knows, Lyons and Jamestown were were really the most catastrophically hit. And because we were looking at municipal governments, we did not choose Jamestown just because of how small it is, but Lyons was our research partner community that was far and away the hardest hit, as we all know, right? All 2,000 residents of Lyons were evacuated for 6 weeks. Our first interviews in Lyons were done the week before Christmas in 2013, because that was the week they formally transitioned from emergency response to disaster recovery. And when we spoke to people in Lyons, it was, I think as many of you who, I know many of you have worked closely with Lyons and cooperated with them and helped them or worked in Lyons. During that 6-week period of evacuation, they held update meetings for the community at a church in Longmont, and hundreds of residents would show up to these meetings, right? Which makes sense, despite the fact that those people were displaced from Loveland and Berthoud to Longmont and Boulder. They would come back, but that was a period of kind of, you know, life and safety, and when do I get to go home, and what am I going to find when I go home, and those types of questions. So that somewhat makes sense, even though it wasn't a very impressive showing of people who came to those meetings. But then at that December meeting where they transitioned to disaster recovery, they said, we now have to go home and rebuild this community and decide what our community is going to look like and what we're going to be. And we can't do that without you. Right, so this is a local government that had an annual operating budget of $1 million prior to the flood, and 17 permanent town staff members, right? So without those sustained stakeholder processes, they wouldn't have been able to do this, which was very counterintuitive to what so much participation research suggests, is that if you have a lot of resources, you do it, and if you don't, you kind of ignore it because it's too difficult. But for Lyons, it was the opposite. Without that engagement, so they asked people at that December meeting, we have these topical areas, whether it's business or housing recovery or parks and recreation and open space, or, you know, they had these sector-based approaches. Sign up for one of these groups, and we're going to be calling on you for the next couple of years to be meeting weekly, monthly, whatever, you know, kind of different groups did different things. But this was a really kind of extraordinary thing, and not without imperfections and difficulties along the way. But without that process, our research partners in Lyons suggested that flood recovery would have looked very different without that kind of sustained engagement by their residents. I don't want to ignore the higher capacity communities, though, because even though that sustained engagement was something that the literature, we never see, right? So like as an academic, I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, this is extraordinary. We never see this kind of thing. We tell you should do this, but no one does it. And so that was exciting to see. But at the same time, so Longmont's a good example here, because Longmont and Loveland to a lesser extent had a really interesting thing happen. So in Longmont, the green line kind of follows the St. Vrain River. So St. Vrain River bisects town west to east in Longmont, right? And one of our interviewees in Longmont the first year said, it was a really interesting event for Longmont. It's a large enough city that if you were on the north end of town and walked out of your house during the precipitation event, you would have just thought it was a bad rainstorm, right? But on the south end of town and kind of on the western side of town in pockets, there was significant damage, right? So as a municipal government, they also faced this potential struggle that as spring runoff came and as people started to go out onto parks and trails and open space as we do in Colorado, and those residents who were not personally affected would come to a place they'd always enjoyed and be really frustrated that it's not opened, right? And so the thing that I think with regards to kind of participation and engagement that Longmont did that was really exceptional was they really had a concerted campaign, a communication campaign that was focused at every rebuilding and recovery site. You saw the same branding, the same logo, the same messaging, that it's Longmont Works Flood Recovery. They have this, you know, of course, in Longmont, everything's about a mountain, a symbol somewhere, right? And so we have the hiker on his way up in terms of like how far we are to recovery and so forth. but it all led back to kind of the bigger picture. And so not only is it focused on telling people that this actually, even if you didn't experience it personally, this was a huge impact on our community, and so please be understanding. That's kind of the implicit message. But it also just showed like we are hard at work and we are spending money because we just raised your park fee or your wastewater fee or whatever. And so that type of thing was, I think, particularly well done here with this just kind of concerted and coordinated campaign throughout. So higher capacity communities, even though they may have had the government capacity to do flood recovery mostly on their own and not require as much engagement, sometimes there were really nice examples of that outreach component as well. So Betsy is now going to talk a bit about some of the vulnerable populations in the communities that we study.
Thank you, Desiree. So one of the aspects of this project that we looked into is the role of resources in recovery response to this extreme flood. And what does the previous research tell us? One is primarily low-resourced or disadvantaged communities often face greater risks of these extreme events compared to higher-resourced communities, or lower resource neighborhoods compared to higher resource neighborhoods within a community may face higher risks, higher damage prospects than others in communities. And also, kind of overlaid with this is that socioeconomics often matter in terms of how people perceive risks. And these extreme events may widen inequities or differences in resources that occurred before an event, and then they are exasperated when the event occurs. And vulnerable populations, and this is again the research prior to the Colorado study, show that oftentimes lack social networks and resources needed during response and recovery. So based on our design, is again, we've talked about the 7 communities that you all are from. We have a varying level of pre-flood demographics in each of the communities, right, across the 3 counties. So this is based on US Census data here, not the public surveys. So we have Larimer, Weld, and Boulder, and you can see here that the communities differ across education level, with Boulder having the highest college degree level compared to Evans on the other end of the spectrum, as well as differing levels of median household income, with Lyons being the highest, Evans being the lowest, and also varying percentages of Latinx populations or Hispanic populations, with Evans at 43%, Greeley 36%, and Longmont and Boulder County being the highest Latinx communities within the 3 communities that we studied. So our question here is, what do we learn about communities that are low resourced or communities of color, neighborhoods of color, right, in the aftermath of an extreme event and in recovery? And a summary of our findings are that resources, access to political authority, and social networks may influence a community's ability to learn from disaster. We saw this come up in many of our interviews about the role of undocumented immigrants and how many undocumented immigrants left their communities post-flood, and were very wary of contact with federal authorities because of their immigration status. We also recognize that individuals with fewer social resources may not have access to disaster relief and recovery, and most often impacts disadvantaged populations who are less likely to recover from these disasters. We see less active participation in recovery processes from lower socioeconomic individuals than we did in the surveys from higher socioeconomic levels. Again, disparity in recovery processes based on individual or household level resources. And it's important to note in many of the interviews with you all, the issue of affordable housing seemed to come to the fore in post-flood recovery. It was an issue in several communities before the flood occurred. It became even more prominent issue on people's political agenda or policy agenda, or an issue that needs to be addressed moving forward in recovery. Again, issues of underlying access to resources. So, and it's also, we looked at, as a measure of household income or household level of resources, we looked at home value and looked at how they self-reported, this is the public survey, self-reported beliefs about how informed or how prepared their household was for a future flood. And again, we saw differences with households of lower reported home value as compared to households with higher reported home value in their perceptions of how informed they are about floods and perceptions of how prepared they feel they are for future flooding. So again, differences across this household level of resources. And next up, we will have Elizabeth, who will be speaking on finance and budget lessons.
All right, thanks for hanging in there with us. This is our last kind of subsection and a little bit of closing as a part of our public participation or public lecture today, and then we'll be shifting into our workshop. So I'm just going to briefly chat about finance and budget lessons related to disaster recovery, and what we're really looking into here is how a community's finances affect their ability to recover. We saw communities with varying extents of damage, varying extents of financial capacity, and how does that work? So this is something that we weren't necessarily planning to study as part of learning in the beginning, but this was something that we heard over and over and over again from various people in our communities at all different levels and said, this is something you guys really need to look into. You need to get our lessons out there to other people. So that's one of the things we're looking forward to hearing more about from you today, and trying to bring those lessons forward to other communities that might experience disasters. So some previous research tells us that FEMA envisions finances as part of the incident command system structure. So this kind of signals to us that they recognize it's important, but it's kind of grouped with that response, not as much with the recovery part of training. I see a lot of you guys nodding at me. This is very firmly fixed. So we saw this as a positive thing, but we also saw that when communities transition to recovery, and this becomes part of their day-to-day process and tracking and buying and all of these things, that training may not reach all of the people that are actually doing that work, and that the procurement processes and training on these things may come too late, maybe a year into potentially having to start recovery. So this halts all sorts of things in a reimbursement-based recovery process. And we know that there are budget reserve policies that suggest that communities should hold budgets that are robust enough to cope with a disaster event. However, when we see things as catastrophic as some of the floods, those budget reserves were much smaller than anything communities needed, so they were turning to other things like intergovernmental agreements and unique sources of funding and different types of funding that they could use instead of going to their budget reserves right away. We also found, as we started to look into this, that there was virtually no research on financial policy lessons that communities learn after disasters. So this was something we heard from you, but we couldn't really find reflected into the literature. So we think this is a place where we can really help bring your messages forward and make a contribution. So one of the first things we did in this area was, through our interviews, we asked what were some of the major financial barriers in your recovery process. And one of the first things was related to the process itself. And as many of you know, flood recovery is a reimbursement-based process. So there are lots of agencies working together. Sometimes the state is allocating money that's given to them by a federal agency like HUD. Sometimes FEMA is directly granting money to people, things like that. And for many of our communities, this reimbursement-based process is difficult because as things get held up in the budget system, if you're not getting reimbursed from your last project, you don't have money to do your next project. And some of our communities had the capacity to move beyond that, but some of them didn't. And this became a big holdup in a place where they needed to kind of figure out how to create a cash flow that wasn't in their community's natural capacity. Compliance was another area we looked at. Procurement is complex, figuring out very difficult situations when your community might have a difficult time even accessing people who can provide a service when a road's closed. And can you go through an appropriate procurement process when it's an emergency situation or you need to get something done right away? And as I mentioned, the training in some communities was not conducted initially for a variety of reasons, and we really gleaned that here capacity is needed, and it's a really difficult area where you want to maintain capacity for people who understand these financial reimbursement-based processes, but it's not something they deal with all the time too, so it's difficult to kind of maintain that knowledge and that capacity. And then finally, we hear a lot about disaster hits a community and they go to FEMA for recovery. And we realized, that's certainly not the case. We saw communities raise internal fees, taxes, bonds, look for external grants from the government and NGOs. And this really taught us that one of the big takeaways we could discuss here is that it's essential to go beyond that and not just think of that as kind of the constraining financial source for disaster recovery. And that might be something that's really helpful to communities who have not yet experienced a disaster and may need to go in knowing this already. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how our financial lessons connect to learning a little bit later. But I will tell you right now that we went through all of those documents that I mentioned before to assess what policy changes we made. And then we pulled out every policy change that was specifically related to finance. And we mapped those on some of the different types of learning that Desiree talked about in the very beginning of this presentation. So I just want to present a couple of those to you. So we saw across all our communities political learning. So this is learning about strategies and tactics. And this was often just figuring out how to better communicate with them, how to better communicate, how to open channels with state officials, things like that. We saw instrumental learning, which is communities finding a new tool or policy that they can use. So for a lot of our communities, this was finding specific processes that worked for them that had to do with funding or procurement. In a couple of our communities, and one in particular we wanted to point out was in Evans, we saw this type of governmental learning, which is really, instead of adding kind of temporary people, it was really significant restructuring, and some of our communities are still doing that right now. So we know that other communities are kind of this idea that going forward, we may need to do kind of broader restructuring. So we saw a consolidation for expedited chain of command there. And then this kind of broader social learning. Learning about new goals, long-term plans, redefining the scope of problems going forward in your community. And here we saw some evidence of social learning in differences in reserve goal increases or decreases. So communities think kind of not just what do I need to do for my budget in my community right now, but what should I think about in my budget in the future that might apply to future, might have better prepare us to deal with future disasters. So we saw an increased reserve goal in Boulder and Estes Park, a decreased reserve goal over time, and how those kind of changes met their broader term social learning. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Desiree for our conclusion.
All right, thank you. So we wanted to end on a little bit more optimistic note here, because so much of studying disasters is obviously bad news and it's difficult. And one thing that we were struck by in all of the communities and all of the people we talked to over the last 4 years was that for so many people, this was really hard and exhausting, and especially municipal staff get overworked and overburdened in those first weeks and months after a disaster. But it was a labor of love to get their communities back to a healthy state. And that was something that struck all of us again and again and again. And so, I mean, you all have seen these various logos and various things that, I mean, communities really were viewing themselves as strong and resilient, right? So they didn't use the term resilience. That's a pretty jargony, wonky term and often misused. But really, I think so many of the messages were about strength and about resilience. And so we wanted to end kind of talking about that idea of resilience. want to give this example, and it's available online. This is Boulder's kind of infographic that they did, and we all know that Boulder has done a tremendous amount of work in the area of resilience over the decades, and Boulder is a leader nationally, certainly, but then it comes to the floods. I mean, they're in the same boat so many of our other communities we're in, where they have very hard hit specific areas of the city, especially residential areas in Boulder, and so similar to those images that I showed in Longmont, this was kind of their summary of how much we've done. Really what they did from planning, response, recovery, and moving on to resilience. So essentially kind of how much money they've spent, how many projects they've done, how many, what percentage of homes they've helped. And so this was kind of their way of communicating this. And I think that something that struck me is that I think all the communities, so many have worked together or collaborated over time, but there's really excellent examples in so many of our communities of some neat things that they've done. And this was a nice summary just of how much work has been done over the last 4 years. So our overall lessons learned, kind of takeaways that we would love you to remember are that, first of all, public process matters, right? So many points in our data have come back to this, that more deliberative processes in the most damaged communities may actually lead to longer term resilience. And this is the counterintuitive part, that sometimes more professionalized staff or higher capacity may lead a municipal government or any government organization to think like, we can handle this on our own, right? Because you have that expertise and you have those resources. But really, by reaching out, even if you don't have to, right? Even if you're not forced to out of capacity reasons and need, that can actually be really important to more long-term successful recovery. That also equity within and across communities matters. And I'll talk about the across in just one second. Betsy mentioned the populations within communities, and so many, I mean, this is not unique at all to Evans or Longmont, which were some of perhaps kind of the more obvious cases, but Estes Park, being a tourist economy, has a lot of international, whether seasonal or kind of hospitality workers. Obviously Boulder has Boulder, everyone kind of thinks is a very wealthy community and is in many ways, but has pockets of real need in the community, right? So thinking about this kind of, even if we tend to simplify kind of the images that we have of communities demographically, but also partnerships across communities. So this was one thing that struck me. I think both some of our folks in Longmont and Lyons told us that if it hadn't been for a partnership formed, the Boulder County community cities have worked together for a long time, for better or worse, over the years, but they have a known kind of established relationship with Longmont, Boulder, and Lyons in particular. And if it hadn't been for kind of a partnership between those three communities kind of advocating to the state and FEMA, Lyons really may have been kind of left out because they don't have the political clout or capacity. And so both Lyons really recognized how important that was to them, and I think that it was very deliberate and intentional on the part of those higher capacity communities to advocate on behalf of their neighbor. So that partnership was important. Also, that risk perceptions do matter, right? So that experts tend to view flood risk as higher than the public, which is important when we're thinking about governance in our communities and trying to communicate that accurately and trying to help people understand that there is a risk. So many of our communities face an ongoing risk. And yet, this really interesting thing that once you've experienced flooding, you may be less likely to perceive future risk of flooding, right? So you can't rely on those people who were hard hit to then communicate to their neighbors that like this is really a problem or a risk that we face, because they may think, okay, we're out of the woods now. So that is a struggle. And that also, as we see the types of policies changed after a disaster, they tend to be very incremental, small in nature, and they tend to be focused on kind of the tools and tactics to do this better, right? To get higher reimbursement rates or to have the capacity. But we do see a few examples where there's kind of broader learning where we understand maybe our actual municipal government kind of org structure needs to be changed slightly to respond better next time or to plan going forward. So if we view, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of resilience being about, both the natural and built environment, the, kind of economic development and diversity of economic sectors, and then community capacity, our research is really focused in that community capacity purple bubble here. And so there's a lot of research that our findings support, which is that learning and true sustained deliberation can lead to kind of higher, more resilient outcomes within that community, trust networks, relationships, and can help not only governments but also NGOs and faith-based sector and else identify who are those people in need, right? How can we help them? Because you've already been working together and have those trusts. And some Colorado communities certainly are better prepared and informed, both going in certainly, but also it was pronounced the differences now that we've had 4 years to reflect on this. And so this idea of participation and deliberation matter, but resource limited communities that are struggling to recover may also struggle to engage their residents, right? And so even though we saw our smaller communities really reach out and engage their residents because they had to, it's tough. That is a really tough thing to do and to sustain over time. And so understanding how communities can do this kind of on a more, multiple sector, broader based and in non-disaster times, so that you can draw on it during a disaster time, right? So if you already have it in place and those relationships are already in place, it can help you during a disaster. And then of course, individual resources matter. So our focus has really been on kind of collective processes and government and policy, and that's what we do as policy researchers, but we don't want to neglect talking about the fact that those individual resources matter. The capacity to recover and rebuild and so forth, and whether they had flood insurance and all of that does matter. And yet those people may be the least likely to participate in those deliberative processes, and they don't have the personal capacity or bandwidth to be there every week and to do this with you. And they may feel the least informed in your community. So that seems to be one area where municipal governments could really target in understanding how we can understand and identify those people and communicate with them. So this is our website. It's learningfromdisasters.org, and we are going to be posting this video. We're going to be posting our final project report on this website. Also, things that academics, we have some academics in the room, would be interested in, our kind of survey data, our survey and interview instruments and other things like that are already up there. And then both news coverage and also our academic papers are posted there. And so hopefully in the next week to 10 days, we'll have the final report from our project based on our workshop today. So as we close, I just want to thank in particular all of the literally hundreds, but especially the dozens of people within state and local government and our partner communities who spent hours with us over the last 4 years. Truly generous with their time, despite the fact that they had much bigger and more pressing things to deal with. And so thank you to all of the people who spent time with us with watershed coalitions, communities, state agencies, and of course our funders, the National Science Foundation and the Natural Hazards Center at CU Boulder, and our departments, School of Public Affairs here at CU Denver, and the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke for supporting us and so much work they've done to help this project. So thank you. And while we transition to the workshop, we'd love to take questions, chat with you, anything you have, or if you want to get up and mill about, grab some food and take a break to check email or go to the restroom before we start the workshop at 10 o'clock, we'd be happy to do that. So questions?